The copper handle of the kettle was hot, but Milton barely felt it. His thumb pressed against the warped metal, feeling for the fracture line where the alloy had given up after 10 years of boiling water. It was a clean break, honest in its failure, unlike so many things in Glimmerholt. He sat at the rough-hewn table in the center of the kitchen, the morning light filtering through the window in dusty, golden shafts. The house was breathing. He could hear the faint, rhythmic expansion of the chimney flue as the hearthline deep beneath the earth pulsed with its morning warmth. Most people ignored the sound, treating it like the beat of their own hearts, but Milton listened. He always listened. He picked up a spool of silver-threaded wire. With a dexterity that belied the size of his calloused hands, he began to weave a repair knot. It was not a simple twist. It was a friction hitch, a technique used by field engineers to secure heavy loads under high stress. He rapped it once, twice, pulling the slack until the wire sang with tension. "Hold together," he murmured to the kettle. "Just hold together for another winter." It was a plea he often directed at himself. A sudden explosion of white dust erupted from the pantry. Milton did not flinch, though his grip on the kettle tightened enough to leave a fingerprint in the cooling copper. He closed his eyes for a second, inhaling the scent of dried herbs from the rafters and the overwhelming chalky smell of high-grade wheat flour. "I got it, I got the bag," a small voice triumphed. "You dropped the bag, Tess," a slightly older, more exasperated voice corrected. "You are literally wearing the bag." Milton turned on his stool. The pantry door was swinging on its hinges. Standing in the doorway were his daughters. Lula, 7 years old and already possessing the weary posture of a logistics officer, was brushing white powder off her apron. Beside her stood Tess, 4 years old, who looked less like a child and more like a ghost that had been rolled in bread dough. "We are making the lantern cake," Tess announced, coughing a small cloud of white into the air. "For the bake." "The lantern bake is not until tomorrow evening," Milton said, his voice calm, the deep baritone of a man who had shouted over artillery fire and now found luxury in quietness. "And the recipe calls for 2 cups of flour, Tess, not the entire harvest of the southern fields." "It fell," Tess explained, widening her eyes. "Gravity is heavy today." Lula sighed, a sound that seemed too old for her lungs. "She tried to climb the shelf, Daddy. I told her the stool was right there. Now we have no flour for the crust, and the floor looks like the winter waste." Milton set the kettle down. The repair held. The silver wire gleamed against the dull copper, a scar that made the object stronger. He stood up, his knees popping with the sound of dry twigs snapping. He walked over to Tess, knelt down, and used his thumb to wipe a smudge of flour from her nose. "Gravity is indeed heavy," Milton agreed. He looked at the disaster zone that was his kitchen floor. It was in the cracks of the floorboards. It was dusting the iron legs of the stove. "And so is the cleaning." "I can fix it," Tess offered, though she did not move. "We need help," Lula said, looking at Milton. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and intelligent. They saw too much. "Mrs. Brindle says a house this size needs 3 heartbeats to keep the dust down. You and me and Tess, we are too busy keeping the roof from flying off." Milton stiffened slightly. "Mrs. Brindle has opinions on everything from the weather to the curvature of the moon." "She is right, though," Lula insisted, crossing her arms. "You work on the repairs all day. I have school. Tess has gravity problems. We need a maid, a real one. Not just me trying to sweep with a broom that is taller than I am." Milton looked at his hands. They were stained with grease and now flour. He had spent 5 years trying to be enough. Mother, father, provider, protector. He had scrubbed clothes until his knuckles bled, and cooked stews that were edible if not enjoyable. But the house knew. The walls creaked with a subtle neglect, the sort that came not from lack of effort, but from lack of time. "A third person," Milton mused. He stood up, towering over the mess. "Fine, you win. We will go to the hall today. Tess cheered, throwing her arms up and releasing another shower of flour. Can we get a drag and a small one to toast the bread? Milton picked up a broom and handed it to Lula, then grabbed a dustpan for himself. No dragons, Tess. We need a third person to help us live, but don't suggest a dragon. The insurance premiums alone would bankrupt us. The walk to the Hearth Hiring Hall was a journey through the lungs of Glimmerholt. The city did not just sit on the earth, it grew out of it. The streets were paved with cobblestones that radiated a faint, gentle heat, keeping the winter chill at bay. Above them, the natural stone arches of the cavern roof glowed with bioluminescent moss, creating a perpetual twilight that shimmered like starlight caught in quartz. It was a beautiful city. It was a cage of light. Milton walked with a stride that was measured and even. He held Tessa's hand on his left and Lula's on his right. The girls were dressed in their best coats, thick wool, dyed deep indigo, contrasting with the gray, rough spun jacket Milton wore. He checked his pocket to ensure the pouch of coins was secure. 15 silver pieces. That was the standard signing bonus for a seasonal contract. Do not stare, Milton reminded them as they entered the district of guilds, and do not ask people about their ears. I like the ears, Tess whispered. I know, but it is rude to point. The Hearth Hiring Hall was a massive structure of black basalt built directly over one of the primary vents of the hearth line. It did not have doors. It had a gaping archway that breathed warm, sulfur-scented air into the street. Inside, the noise was a low, constant hum, the sound of hundreds of voices negotiating the terms of their lives. The interior was vast. In the center of the hall stood the public furnace, a massive iron grate where coal and sweetwood burned day and night. The smoke was channeled up through copper flues, heating the ink pots on the dozens of scribe tables, arranged in concentric circles around the fire. This was where Glimmerholt bound its people. Stay close, Milton commanded. He navigated the crowd with practiced ease. There were humans here, mostly young men and women looking for apprenticeships. There were stonekin, heavy and gray-skinned, offering their strength for construction vows. And there were the others. Milton tried not to look at the section reserved for the debt-bound, but his eyes flickered there automatically. It was a habit from the war. Assess the threats. Assess the casualties. He approached the clerk at the intake desk, a man with ink stains up to his elbows. House repair and domestic maintenance, Milton said, his voice cutting through the din. Single household. 2 children. Seasonal contract renewable based on performance. The clerk didn't look up. Standard or vow-bound? Standard, Milton said firmly. I pay wages. I do not buy debts. The clerk paused, then looked up, adjusting his spectacles. He scanned Milton's face, perhaps looking for the lie. In Glimmerholt, few people paid wages when a vow-bound servant was cheaper. Standard contracts are in the West Wing, row 4. Milton nodded and steered the girls toward the indicated area. The West Wing was quieter. The people here were waiting for work, not salvation. They sat on long wooden benches, clutching their references and their tools. Lula tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, look. Milton followed her gaze. She was sitting at the end of the bench, separated from the others by a foot of empty space, as if her silence was a physical barrier. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, the hem frayed but clean. Her hands were folded in her lap, stillness personified. She was Falari. Her ears, triangular and tufted with soft fur the color of sand, twitched toward the sound of their approach, though she did not turn her head. A long, slender tail curled around her ankle, the tip moving with a hypnotic, slow rhythm. But it was the bracelet on her right wrist that caught Milton's attention. It was a single band of black thread woven tight against the skin. It was a mourning band, or a silence band. In the Falari culture, it meant a promise broken, or a promise that could not be spoken. Milton slowed his pace. He had intended to hire a sturdy human woman, someone like Mrs. Brindle, who knew how to starch collars and bake pies. He did not want complications. The Falari were complications. Their culture was built on the absolute sanctity of the voluntary promise, and in a city like Glimmerholt where vows were currency, they were often chewed up and spit out. "Daddy," Lula whispered again, more urgent this time. Milton looked down at his daughter. Her eyes were wide-fixed on the Catwoman. "What is it, Lula?" "It is her," Lula breathed. "Who?" Lula pulled Tess closer, as if sharing a secret that was too big for one child to hold. She leaned into Milton's coat and whispered a name. "Leona." Milton stopped. His boots scraped against the stone floor, a harsh sound that made several people look up. He felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. He had never spoken that name to them. Not once. He had buried that name 10 years ago in a trench filled with ash and snow 500 miles from Glimmerholt. He had buried it alongside his rank and his ability to sleep through the night. "What did you say?" Milton asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Leona," Lula repeated, pointing a small finger. "Like in the story, the one who walks on smoke." Milton looked back at the woman on the bench. She had turned. Her eyes were striking gold with vertical pupils that dilated as they locked onto his. She did not look like a servant hoping for a master. She looked like a soldier assessing a perimeter. Her gaze swept over the girls, softening for a fraction of a second before snapping up to meet Milton's face. She stared at him. It was not a casual glance. She was searching him. She was looking at the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the scar that ran through his left eyebrow. She was checking for the ghost of the man he used to be. Milton felt it then, a heat. It started in his right wrist beneath the cuff of his shirt. It was not the heat of the room or the furnace. It was a searing, sharp pain like a brand being pressed against the bone. It was the iron speech waking up. It was the power of a hearthwarden responding to a call he hadn't issued. He gripped his wrist with his other hand, squeezing hard to suppress the sensation. "Stay down," he ordered the power. "Stay dead." The Falari woman, Leona, stood up. Her movement was fluid, water flowing uphill. She took one step toward them, then stopped, her ears flattening slightly against her skull. "You," she said. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "You are taller than I remembered." Milton's heart hammered against his ribs. "And you," he replied, his voice rough, "are supposed to be on the other side of the continental ridge." "The ridge is cold," she said simply. "And I hate the cold." "Daddy," Tess looked between them. "Is she the cat lady? Does she eat mice?" "I do not eat mice," Leona said, looking down at Tess. A corner of her mouth lifted, a micro-expression of amusement. "Too many bones. I prefer soup." "We like soup," Tess declared. Milton opened his mouth to speak, to demand how she was here, how his children knew her name, and why his wrist felt like it was dissolving into molten lead. But the air in the hall suddenly changed. The ambient chatter died down. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, though the furnace roared on. A man was walking toward them. He moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. He was tall, thin, and wore the high-collared coat of a hearth scribe, the black velvet embroidered with silver thread that mimicked the layout of the city streets. He held a clipboard made of polished slate. Rowan Pike. Milton knew him. Everyone knew him. Pike was the auditor of vows. He was the man who ensured that every promise made in Glimmerholt was recorded, measured, and enforced. He did not carry a weapon. He did not need one. He carried the law. "Milton Vance," Pike said, his voice smooth and cultivated. He stopped 3 feet away, respecting the personal space in a way that felt like an insult. "I saw your name on the intake ledger. It is a rare pleasure to see a veteran of the Ash Wars engaging in the domestic economy." Milton shifted his stance, placing himself slightly between Pike and the girls. "Mr. Pike, I am just hiring a maid." Pike's pale gray eyes slid over Milton's shoulder and landed on Leona. A flicker of distaste crossed his face, so brief it might have been a trick of the light. "A Falari," Pike noted, "and one with a complicated history, if the ledger is correct." He tapped the slate with a stylus made of bone. "Leona. No surname recorded. Recent arrival from the borderlands. Status unbound, but under provisional watch." Leona did not flinch. She held her chin high, but her tail wrapped tight around her leg, a sign of extreme tension. "She is looking for work," Milton said. "I am offering it. Is there a problem?" "Not a problem, Mr. Vance, a procedure." Pike stepped closer, the smell of expensive ink and cold stone clinging to him. "The city has new ordinances regarding the employment of non-citizens who possess certain natural agilities. To ensure the safety of the hearth, we require a specific addendum to the standard service vow." Pike extended the slate. On it lay a piece of parchment already filled with the dense angular script of the administration. "Read Clause 4, Pike suggested. Milton looked at the paper. The words seemed to swim for a moment before snapping into focus. Clause 4, the vow taker. "Leona shall not speak, whisper, or write her hearth name nor the true name of her lineage beneath the roof of the vow-giver, Milton Vance. Identity shall be limited to the function of service." Milton looked up, his brow furrowing. "This is absurd. A hearth name is how the house recognizes a resident. If she cannot speak it, the house will treat her like a stranger. The chimney won't draw for her. The doors will stick." "It is a safety measure," Pike said smoothly. "Falari names have power, Mr. Vance. We cannot have transient workers bonding with the architecture of Glimmerholt. It creates messy entanglements when it is time for them to leave." "I am not signing this," Milton said, handing the slate back. "It's demeaning. I'm hiring a person, not a broom." Leona made a sound, a low vibration in her throat. "Milton," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded heavy on her tongue. "It does not matter." "It matters to me," Milton snapped. "Mr. Vance." Pike interrupted his voice, dropping an octave, becoming harder. "Let us be practical. The atmospheric barometers are falling. The ash fog is expected within the hour. If you do not sign a contract before the fog rolls and the hall closes, you go home alone. The Falari woman goes back to the street where the fog will. You know what the null frost does to those without a hearth to protect them." Milton looked at the high windows of the hall. Outside, the glowing moss was dimming. A gray haze was beginning to curl against the glass. The ash fog. It carried the null frost, a supernatural cold that didn't just freeze water. It froze the will. It ate away at memories and promises. He looked at Leona. She was looking at the window too, her ears flattened. She was terrified, though she hid it well. He looked at Lula. "Daddy," Lula said softly, "you have to take her. You tell the stories. You said Leona is the one who remembers the way home." Milton froze. "I never told you that story, Lula." "You did," she insisted. "When you sleep in the chair. When you have the bad dreams. You talk to her. You say, 'Leona, show me the map. Leona, don't let the fire go out.'" Milton felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had thought he suffered his nightmares in silence. He had thought he was containing the leakage of his past. He was wrong. His children had been listening to his ghosts for years. He looked back at Leona. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read: sadness. Expectation. "I thought I only existed in the stories too," Leona said. Her voice was dry, cracking slightly at the edges. A distinct attempt at humor to defuse the bomb that was ticking between them. "But apparently, I am here, and I am quite allergic to freezing to death." Milton looked at Pike, who was waiting with the patience of a vulture. "Give me the quill," Milton growled. Pike smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. He handed Milton a quill dipped in ash ink, a mixture of soot from the public furnace and binding agents. When it dried, it was permanent. Milton placed the parchment on the slate. He did not look at Clause 4. He looked at the bottom line. Vow giver. He pressed the quill to the paper. His hand trembled not from fear, but from the immense effort of holding back the power in his blood. He just needed to sign his name. Just a signature. No iron speech. No binding magic. Just ink. He wrote Milton Vance. As he lifted the quill, the ink did not dry instantly as it should have. Instead, the black liquid seemed to pulse. It spread outward from his signature, shooting little tendrils across the fiber of the paper. For a second, just one heartbeat, the ink formed a shape. It looked exactly like a claw digging into the page. Pike blinked, leaning in closer. A heavy hand, Mr. Vance. You must be out of practice with a quill. Milton dropped the quill. He grabbed his wrist, rubbing the skin where the heat was now fading to a dull ache. It is signed, Milton said, his voice ragged. She is with me. So she is, Pike said, taking the slate back. He blew gently on the ink, though the claw shape remained looking ominous and sharp. Welcome to domestic service, Leona. Remember the clause. Silence is golden, especially for your kind. Pike turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of scribes. Milton stood there for a moment, breathing hard. The ash fog was pressing against the glass, now turning the world outside into a swirl of gray. Well, Leona said. She picked up a small canvas bag from under the bench. I suppose we should go before the city turns into a refrigerator. She looked at Lula and Tess. She didn't smile, but her tail uncurled from her leg and gave a little wave. Hello, little ones, she said. I promise not to bring any mice. Can you bring cookies? Tess asked. Negotiable, Leona replied. Milton looked at the woman he had just bound to his house. He looked at the daughters who knew secrets he had never told them. He looked at the claw mark on the contract in Pike's hands across the room. Let's go home, Milton said. But as they walked toward the great archway, stepping out into the biting cold that preceded the fog, Milton knew one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't just hired a maid. He had just invited the storm inside. The house on Chimney Row was number 42, a narrow, two-story structure of red brick that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it were trying to listen to the gossip of the neighbors. Like all houses in Glimmerholt, it was alive in the quiet geological sense. The mortar breathed, expanding and contracting with the thermal pulse of the hearthline deep below. Milton unlocked the front door. The key was heavy iron, and the lock tumbled with a satisfying mechanical thunk. He pushed the door open and stepped aside to let the girls and their new charge enter. Shoes off by the mat, Milton instructed automatically. Coats on the hooks. If the hook is too high, leave it on the bench. Do not throw it on the floor. The floor is not a wardrobe. Lula and Tess scrambled in, peeling off their layers, with the chaotic energy of children returning to their territory. Leona followed them, but her entrance was different. She did not stomp or bustle. She flowed across the threshold, her feet making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. She stopped 3 feet inside the room. Her ears swiveled independently, rotating 180 degrees. Her golden eyes swept the room, not looking at the decor, but scanning the corners. She looked at the back door. She looked at the windows. She looked at the heavy iron poker sitting by the fireplace. Finally, her gaze landed on the knife block in the kitchen. 2 exits on the ground floor, Leona said, her voice low and raspy. Windows are single pane, easy to breach, but poor insulation. Sightlines from the street are limited by the hedge, which is good. The kitchen knives are accessible, but the heavy cast iron pans would make better bludgeons in close quarters. She blinked, her pupils contracting, as she realized she had spoken aloud. She looked at Milton, her tail twitching once sharply. "Apologies," she said, smoothing the front of her gray dress. "Old habits. My ears hear danger before my eyes see safety." Milton closed the door, shutting out the cold wind. He looked at her. Really looked at her, seeing past the maid's uniform to the tension in her shoulders. He knew that stance. He had seen it in the mirror for 5 years. "The windows are double-latched," Milton said, his voice level, "and the hedge is thorny. But in this house, the most dangerous thing you will face is not an assassin." Leona tilted her head. "Is it the boiler? Does it leak carbon monoxide?" "No," Milton said, gesturing to where Tess was currently trying to open a bag of flour with her teeth. "It is children with baking ingredients. If you turn your back for 10 seconds, the kitchen becomes a winter landscape." Leona looked at Tess. A small, dry sound escaped her throat, a rhythmic k-k-k sound, like a soft engine turning over. It was a laugh, but it vibrated in her chest rather than escaping her mouth. It was the sound of a cat chortling. Tess froze, the bag of flour half open. She looked at Leona, her eyes wide. Then she scrunched up her nose and tried to mimic the sound. "K-k-k." Leona's ears perked up. She looked at the small human, and for the first time her expression softened completely. "Not quite, little kit. You are using too much throat, not enough lung." Lula giggled, the tension of the hiring hall finally evaporating. "She sounds like the kettle when it boils dry." "I do not," Leona protested, though the tip of her tail gave a little wag. "I sound like dignity." "You sound like family," Tess declared, finally ripping the bag open. A puff of white flour exploded into the air, dusting the toes of Leona's worn boots. Leona didn't flinch. She simply looked down at her boots, then at Milton. "I assume my first task is damage control." "Your first task," Milton said, hanging his coat, "is to make sure we survive until dinner." The next 3 days fell into a rhythm that was both strange and surprisingly comfortable. Milton had expected friction. He was a man who lived by precise routines: coffee at 6 o'clock workshop, at 7 o'clock lunch, at 12 o'clock sharp. He expected a stranger in the house to disrupt the ecosystem. Instead, Leona seemed to slot into the empty spaces of the house as if she had been measured for them. She did not clean in the human way. She did not scrub and bang buckets. She moved through the rooms like a shadow. Milton would be working in his repair shop attached to the back of the house, fixing a toaster or a clockwork bird, and when he came into the kitchen for water, the sink would be empty, the counters wiped and the curtains tied back at the exact angle to let in the maximum amount of light without the glare. But it was the food that was the adjustment. On the third evening, Milton sat at the dinner table, staring down at a bowl of something. It was pale green. It smelled of earth and something floral, like crushed violets. "It is a traditional falari broth," Leona explained. She was standing by the stove, not sitting with them, despite Milton's invitation. She claimed she preferred to eat while standing, another soldier's habit, Milton noted. "Made from pressed moon nuts and cavern moss. High in protein, good for night vision." "It's green," Tess said, poking it with her spoon. "Green is a good color," Leona said. "Trees are green, money is green. Aliens in your father's stories are green." "Eat it, Tess," Milton said, picking up his spoon. "We are polite to the chef." He took a spoonful. The taste was indescribable. It started out tasting like warm milk, then shifted to something resembling spinach, and finished with a kick of spice that felt like licking a 9-volt battery. Milton's eyes watered. He swallowed hard, feeling the heat travel down his throat. "It is," Milton wheezed slightly, reaching for his water glass. "Robust." "It makes your tongue fuzzy," Tess yelled happily. "I like it." Lula was eating hers quietly, watching her father with amusement. "Daddy is crying." "I am not crying," Milton choked out. I am just moved by the complexity of the flavor profile. Leona turned from the stove. She was holding a dishcloth, her tail swaying slowly behind her. She looked at Milton, and her eyes crinkled at the corners. It is too spicy for you. Humans have delicate palates. I should have used less fire root. No, Milton lied, taking another spoonful to prove a point he wasn't sure he needed to prove. It is delicious. I haven't had fire root since... He stopped. He hadn't had fire root since the siege of Ash Valley 10 years ago. It was a ration supplement used by the Allied Falari scouts to keep warm in the snow. Leona went still. She lowered the dishcloth. Since the war, she asked softly. The table went quiet. The word hung in the air, heavy and gray. Yes, Milton said, his voice losing its humor. Since the war. He saw Leona looking at him. She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his hands specifically, his right wrist, which he kept covered, even indoors with the thick cuff of his flannel shirt. Beneath that cuff was the mark of the hearthwarden, a scar that looked like a burn but was actually a seal. She knows, Milton thought. She sees the way I guard it. Leona turned back to the sink, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary vigor. I will make roast chicken tomorrow, she said, her voice brisk. Something boring for your delicate tongue. Thank you, Milton said, exhaling. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Milton came downstairs to check the locks. It was his ritual. Front door, back door, windows. He found Leona sitting in the armchair by the dying fire. She wasn't reading. She wasn't sleeping. She was just watching the embers. Her knees pulled up to her chest, her tail wrapped around her toes. She looked small. When she was working, she was all efficiency and sharp angles. But here, in the dim orange light, she looked like something that had been hunted for a very long time. You don't have to guard the fire, Milton said softly from the doorway. It won't go out. The hearthline is strong tonight. Leona didn't jump. She turned her head slowly. The fire is not what I am watching, Milton. What then? The shadows, she said. They move differently here. In the borderlands, shadows are just absence of light. Here in Glimmerholt, the shadows have weight. They feel like memory. Milton walked into the room and sat on the ottoman opposite her. He kept his distance. This house has a lot of memory. Some of it isn't good. Leona looked at him. You tell your daughters stories about me, about a Falari named Leona. Milton rubbed his face with his hands. I didn't know it was you, not really. I remembered a scout, a runner who dragged 3 men out of a collapsed bunker in Sector 7. I didn't know her name then. I just remembered the eyes. I remember a lieutenant, Leona said quietly, who held the ceiling up with his back for 2 hours so we could crawl out. He screamed the whole time, but he didn't drop it. Milton looked away. The memory was sharp, the smell of concrete dust, the crushing weight of the earth, the sound of his own vertebrae grinding. That was the day he had first used the iron speech, the forbidden command language of the Hearthwardens, to tell the stone to hold. That man is gone, Milton said. He retired. He fixes toasters now. You wear long sleeves, Milton, Leona said. Her voice was not accusing, just observational. Even when it is warm, you cover your wrists like a man wearing handcuffs. They are not handcuffs, Milton said defensively. No, Leona agreed. Handcuffs are put on by someone else. You put these on yourself. She stood up, unfolding her limbs with grace. She walked past him toward the stairs, but stopped next to his shoulder. She didn't touch him, but he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Thank you for the job, Milton, she whispered. And for eating the soup. I know it tasted like battery acid. It was memorable, Milton conceded. She went upstairs, her footsteps silent. Milton stayed by the fire, rubbing his right wrist through the flannel. The scar beneath it itched a deep bone-level irritation. The power was there sleeping, waiting for a command he swore he would never give again. Because the last time he had given a command, he had saved 3 lives, but he had leveled a city block. The day of the lantern bake arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums. It was the biggest festival of the season in Glimmerholt. The idea was simple. Every household baked a loaf of bread or a cake, placed a small lantern inside a hollowed-out center, and carried it to the central plaza. It was a symbolic offering to the hearthline, feeding the fire that warmed them all. Chimney Row was buzzing with activity. Streamers made of vow-thread colorful yarn, spun from the wool of fire sheep, were strung between the houses. They symbolized the connections between neighbors. "Hold still, Tess," Milton commanded. He was trying to tie a ribbon in her hair. "I am a wiggle worm," Tess announced, vibrating. "She ate 3 spoonfuls of sugar when you were in the bathroom," Lula reported from the doorway. Lula was dressed in her best coat, holding a basket covered with a cloth. Inside was the lantern cake. It was slightly lopsided, and the crust was a bit burnt, but it was theirs. Leona stepped out of the kitchen. She had traded her gray uniform for a simple dress of dark blue wool that Milton had bought her the day before. It matched her eyes. "The barometer is dropping," Leona said. She wasn't smiling. She was looking at the sky. "The pressure has fallen 20 millibars in the last hour. That is not normal weather patterns." "It's just the season changing," Milton said, though he felt a twinge of unease. He picked up his coat. "Come on. If we are late, Mrs. Brindle will accuse us of sabotaging the community spirit." They walked out into the street. The air was festive, filled with the smell of roasting nuts and caramelized sugar. Neighbors waved. Garen Slate, the massive stonekin who ran the etching shop down the street, raised a hand the size of a shovel. "Milton!" Garen boomed his voice like grinding rocks. "Good to see you. And this must be the new help, Leona." Milton introduced, keeping it brief. "Nice to meet you," Garen said. He looked at Leona with mild curiosity, but no malice. Stonekin were generally indifferent to politics. "Keep an eye on the wind, Milton. My joints are aching." "Means the Null Frost is restless." They reached the edge of the plaza. It was packed. Thousands of people, thousands of lanterns. The light was beautiful, a sea of warm orange bobbing in the twilight. But then the wind changed. It didn't blow. It sucked. The air suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been pulled out of the street. The warm glow of the lanterns didn't flicker. It dimmed, turning a sickly violet. "Daddy." Lula gripped Milton's hand. "My bracelet feels tight." Milton looked down. On Lula's wrist was a simple cord bracelet he had tied for her years ago, a hearth knot, meant to symbolize safety. The knot was unraveling. Not untying, rotting. The fibers were turning gray and disintegrating, as if they had aged 100 years in a second. "Get close to me," Milton barked. His voice shifted instantly from father to commander. Leona was already moving. She stepped behind Tess and Lula, her body angling to shield them from the north. Her tail was lashed tight against her side. "It is the ash fog," Leona hissed. "But it is moving too fast. This is not natural drift." From the northern end of the plaza, where the great ventilation grates of the city, stood a fog rolled in. It wasn't moist or wet. It was dry gray and sparkled with a terrible cold light. It was the null frost, the localized weather phenomenon that ate heat and binding magic. A scream rang out from the crowd. A woman's lantern had gone out. Not just extinguished, but the bread itself had turned to gray dust crumbling in her hands. "The vows!" someone shouted. "Look at the vows!" Above them, the colorful yarn streamers connecting the houses were snapping. They turned gray and dissolved, drifting down like dirty snow. The symbolic connection of the community was physically rotting away. "We need to leave," Milton said. "Now." He turned to lead them back to Chimney Row, but the crowd, panic had started. People were shoving, running. The warmth of the street was vanishing. The cobblestones, usually warm, were turning icy beneath their feet. "My cake!" Lula cried. She had been jostled and the basket slipped from her hand. "Leave it, Lula!" Milton ordered. "No!" Lula dove for the basket. "Lula!" Milton lunged for her, but the press of the crowd separated them for a fraction of a second. In that second, the Nullfrost surged. A wave of gray mist washed over the spot where Lula crouched. The cold was absolute. It wasn't just temperature. It was a silence that deafened the soul. Lula screamed. She was holding the basket, but the dough inside was freezing instantly. The cold was crawling up her arms. Her breath was coming in short, terrified gasps. "It hurts," she wailed. "Daddy, the fire is gone." Milton pushed a stonekin aside, with strength he shouldn't have possessed. He reached Lula and grabbed her shoulders. Her skin was freezing. The frost was seeking the heat of her life force. "Leona!" Milton roared. Leona was there. She didn't panic. She didn't run. She dropped to her knees beside Lula and placed her hands directly on the freezing basket of bread, right over the lantern that was flickering about to die. "Don't let it go out," Milton said, his eyes wild. "If the light goes, the cold takes her." Leona nodded. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown black. She took a breath. She began to hum. It wasn't a song. It was a resonance, a deep guttural vibration that started in her chest and traveled down her arms. It was the old tongue of the Filaria sound that mimicked the purr of a mother cat, but amplified. It was a sound of keeping. Rum, thrum, rum, thrum. The air around them vibrated. Milton watched stunned. He saw something no one else noticed. The ink on the hiring contract in his pocket, he could feel it burning. The ink was reacting to her voice. The flame in the lantern, which had dwindled to a blue spark, suddenly roared. It didn't burn yellow. It burned a brilliant, defiant gold. The heat exploded outward from Leona's hands. It wasn't fire. It was pure caloric energy. It hit the Nullfrost and shattered it. The gray fog hissed and recoiled, evaporating into harmless steam. The circle of warmth expanded, pushing the crowd back, creating a sanctuary around the two girls and Milton. Lula gasped, the color returning to her cheeks. "It's warm," she whispered. "It sings." Leona stopped humming. She slumped forward, exhausted, her hands smoking slightly. The immediate danger had passed. The Nullfrost had been pushed back, momentarily confused by the sudden spike of thermal energy. But the silence that followed was worse than the scream. The crowd had stopped running. They were staring. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on Leona. In Glimmerholt, magic was done with ink and stone, with written contracts and approved rituals. It was not done with a voice. It was not done by a Filari. "That was unauthorized," a voice cut through the silence. Milton stood up, pulling Lula and Tess behind him. He looked up. Standing on a raised platform near the fountain, looking down at them like a judge on a high bench, was Rowan Pike. He was holding his slate, and he was smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally found the missing variable in an equation. "Civil Code 89. Pike announced, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the plaza. "Unregistered use of resonant frequency by a non-citizen within a Class A hearth zone." Two hearth guards dressed in the heavy leather aprons of the guild stepped forward, flanking Pike. "She saved my daughter," Milton shouted, his voice hard as iron. "The frost was taking her." "The frost is a natural phenomenon," Pike replied, calmly. "Her actions, however, are a violation of the fundamental laws of physics and governance of this city. We cannot have unregulated heat sources, Mr. Vance. It destabilizes the hearthline." Pike stepped down from the platform, walking toward them. The crowd parted for him. "Leona," Pike said, reading from his slate. "You have broken the terms of your provisional residency. You have used a hearth song without a license." Leona stood up. She was trembling, but she stood tall. "I used a lullaby." Is it a crime to sing to a child? When the song manipulates thermodynamics, yes, Pike said. He looked at Milton. This requires a formal inquiry, a hearth hearing. You want to put her on trial? Milton asked, stepping forward, his fists clenched. For saving a life. I want to audit the event, Pike corrected, to ensure the safety of the community. The hearing will be held at the Candle Dais, tomorrow at noon. Pike leaned in close to Milton, his voice dropping to a whisper. And, Mr. Vance, I suggest you check your own temperature. You smell like ozone. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were resident yourself. Pike straightened up and addressed the guards. Issue the citation. We will see them at the dais. The guards handed Milton a slip of black paper. It felt cold in his hand. Pike turned and walked away, the crowd murmuring in his wake. Milton stood there in the middle of the ruined festival. The streamers were rotting on the ground. The lanterns were dead. He looked at Lula, who was clutching Leona's hand. He looked at Leona, who looked terrified, not for herself, but for them. And then he looked at his own right wrist. He could feel the pulse of the Hearthwarden power beating against his skin, angry and demanding. He had held it back. He had stayed hidden. And because he had stayed hidden, Leona had been forced to expose herself. If I keep hiding, Milton realized with a sickening clarity, I am not protecting them. I am just letting someone else take the fall. Let's go home, Milton said. His voice was different now. The humor was gone, the tiredness was gone. It was the voice of the man who had held up the ceiling. We have a trial to prepare for. The Candle Dais was less of a courtroom and more of an altar to public scrutiny. Located in the dead center of the Merchant Square, it was a raised platform of white limestone, worn smooth by centuries of judgments. Surrounding the perimeter were the ash candles pillars of compressed black wax as thick as tree trunks standing 6 feet high. Legend said the ash candles were mixed with the soot of the first hearth. When a truth was spoken within the circle, the flames would burn tall and gold. When a lie was told, they would sputter blue. And if a vow was broken, they would weep hot black wax. It was 12 o'clock. The sun should have been at its zenith, punching through the cavern roof's natural skylights. Instead, the light was milky and diffuse, filtered through a haze of atmospheric pressure that felt like a headache waiting to happen. Milton Vance stood on the left side of the dais. He wore his best suit, which was 10 years out of fashion, the elbows reinforced with leather patches he had sewn himself. He stood at parade rest hands, clasped behind his back, feet shoulder-width apart. It was the stance of a man waiting for a mortar barrage. Behind him sat Lula and Tess on a wooden bench flanked by Mara Brindle. The herbalist looked ready to hit someone with her handbag. Lula looked pale, clutching her wrist where the unraveling bracelet had been replaced by a simple bandage. Tess was currently staring at the giant candles with the intense concentration of a pyromaniac in training. "Daddy," Tess whispered loudly. "If the big candles melt, do we get a giant cake?" "Hush, Tess," Milton murmured, not breaking his gaze from the opposition. "This is serious." "It is boring," Tess corrected. "And Mr. Pike looks like a pencil." On the right side of the dais stood Rowan Pike. He did indeed look like a pencil-sharp graphite gray and rigid. He had set up a small podium for his slate, arranging his documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate a limb. Behind him stood the 2 hearth guards, looking uncomfortable in their ceremonial armor. And in the center, standing alone in the circle of judgment, was Leona. She wore the blue dress Milton had bought her, but she had removed the apron. She stood not like a maid, but like a Falari huntress who had been cornered, but was deciding which throat to rip out first. Her tail was still the tip, twitching only once every 10 seconds. The crowd pressed against the ropes surrounding the dais. It seemed half of Glimmerholt had turned out. Rumors of the ice-breaking witch had spread faster than the flu. Pike cleared his throat. The sound was amplified by the acoustics of the stone circle, echoing across the square. "We are gathered under the sight of the hearth," Pike began his voice, smooth as oil. To adjudicate the case of the city versus the provisional resident known as Leona. The charge is the unauthorized manipulation of thermal dynamics and the violation of the hearth vow, specifically Clause 4 regarding the concealment of identity. Pike turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. Citizens of Glimmerholt, we all know the laws are not here to punish. They are here to protect. The Hearthline is a delicate system. It requires order. It requires predictability. He pointed a long finger at Leona. This creature, well, perhaps well-intentioned, introduced a chaotic variable. She used a Falari resonant song, a magic of the wild, a magic that does not ask for permission. A murmur went through the crowd. Wild magic, someone whispered. Unsafe. Remember the collapse in Sector 9? Milton stepped forward. He did not have a podium. He did not need one. Objection, Milton said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the gravel of command. She did not introduce chaos, Mr. Pike. She stopped it. The Null Frost was eating the plaza. She did not break the Hearthline. She fed it. With unauthorized fuel, Pike countered immediately. A car that drives on the sidewalk to avoid traffic is still breaking the law, Mr. Vance, even if it gets to the destination. Pike picked up a piece of parchment. Furthermore, the defendant is bound by a service vow, a vow she signed freely, a vow that explicitly forbids the use of her true name or heritage magic under your roof. By singing that song, she invoked her lineage. She broke the contract. The ash candles flickered. They did not dim, but they did not flare. They remained neutral, waiting. Freely, Milton repeated. He walked to the center of the dais, stopping just outside the circle of wax. He pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. It was his house log, where he tracked expenses and repairs. I have here the record of employment, Milton said, holding it up. And I have called a witness to the nature of this freedom. He nodded to Mara Brindle. Mara stood up, smoothing her skirt. She walked to the railing, glaring at Pike. State your name and occupation, Pike said, bored. Mara Brindle. I sell herbs that cure the headaches people like you cause, Mara snapped. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. I was there when Milton brought the girl home. I saw the contract. And, Milton prompted. And it is garbage, Mara declared. I have lived in Glimmerholt for 60 years. I have seen thousands of service vows. Never, not once, have I seen a clause that forbids a person from speaking their own name in their own home. A hearth name is a soul anchor. Taking it away isn't employment. It is erasure. It is a standard safety precaution for non-humans, Pike argued, adjusting his cuffs. It is a muzzle, Garen Slate's deep voice boomed. The massive stonekin stepped out from the crowd, crushing a cobblestone under his weight. He held up a slab of slate. I am a master etcher. I know the weight of ink. This contract wasn't written to bind a worker. It was written to silence a witness. Pike stiffened. The Stonekin are not experts in civic law. We are experts in pressure, Garen rumbled. And this contract puts too much pressure on the stone. It is structurally unsound. The ash candles flared. The flame on the northern candle shot up 6 inches, burning bright gold. The truth of Garen's words had resonated. Pike's eyes narrowed. He realized he was losing the moral high ground. He switched tactics. Sympathy is cheap, Pike said coldly. But facts are stubborn. The fact is, this woman is a Falari, a species known for their transient loyalty. They wander. They leave. They do not understand the permanence of Glimmerholt. To trust one with the safety of a hearth is like trusting a wolf to watch the sheep. He turned to the crowd, playing his ace. Do you want your children safe, or do you want to let wild things sleep by your fire? The crowd shifted. Fear was an easy button to press. People looked at Leona with suspicion. She was different. She had claws. She had eyes that saw in the dark, Leona stepped forward. She did not look at Pike. She looked at the crowd. She looked at a woman in the front row holding a baby. "I am not a wolf," Leona said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the dais it was clear. "And you are not sheep. You are people who are cold." She turned to Pike. "You call it a service vow," she said, "but a vow is a promise between two equals. I give you labor. You give me shelter. That is a trade. But when you take my name, when you tell me I cannot be who I am—" She raised her hand, showing the black mourning band on her wrist. "That is not a vow," Leona said. "That is a shackle made of ink. You did not ask me to promise my service, High Scribe. You asked me to promise my submission. And in my culture, a promise made under duress is no promise at all. It is a lie waiting to burn." The ash candles roared. All 12 of them. The flames turned a brilliant, blinding white gold. The heat washed over the square. "She speaks true," a voice cried out. It was Perrin Latch the baker. He was standing on a crate to see over the crowd, still wearing his flour-dusted apron. "Mr. Pike," Perrin shouted, waving a baguette like a baton, "I bake bread. The yeast needs room to rise. If I put a lid on the dough and screw it down tight, I don't get bread. I get a bomb." The crowd laughed, tension breaking. "If the vow is good," Perrin continued, looking around, "why are you so afraid of her name? If the system is strong, it should be able to handle a name. I am just asking for my oven, and for common sense." Pike's face flushed a blotchy red. "Order," he shouted. "This is a court, not a bakery. The law is not subject to yeast metaphors." He slammed his hand down on the podium. "I demand judgment," Pike yelled. "The law is absolute. Code 89 is clear. She is a danger to crack." It was not the sound of a gavel. It was the sound of the world breaking. The noise came from beneath the dais. It sounded like a glacier snapping in half. The limestone floor under Leona's feet developed a hairline fracture that ran zigzag toward Milton. The temperature in the square dropped 30 degrees in 1 second. The ash candles didn't just flicker. They gasped. The tall golden flames were suddenly sucked down, turning into tiny blue pinpricks. "The frost!" someone screamed. From the cracks in the stone, a gray vapor poured out. It was heavy, thicker than smoke, moving with a sluggish, predatory intelligence. The null frost. It wasn't attacking the people. It was attacking the candles. The frost coiled around the base of the nearest ash candle. The wax turned gray, then crumbled into dust. The flame died without even a wisp of smoke. "Stay back." "Duh," Pike ordered, though his voice cracked. He held up his slate, pointing it at the vapor. "By the authority of the Hearth Scribe Guild, I order a cessation of—" The mist lashed out. It struck the slate in Pike's hand. The stone tablet shattered, turning to ice and exploding into shards. Pike scrambled back, falling over his own robes, his dignity evaporating faster than the wax. "Procedure doesn't work on the cold, you idiot!" Milton roared. He vaulted over the railing. "Leona, the girls!" Leona was already moving. The null frost was surging up from the center of the dais, a geyser of freezing silence. It formed a shape vague, shifting like a giant hand made of winter, and it lunged toward the source of the most heat, the children on the bench. Lula screamed, shielding Tess. Leona threw herself between the mist and the girls. She did not sing this time. There was no time for a lullaby. She hissed a sound of pure, primal aggression. Her claws extended, not just the nails, but glowing extensions of energy bright as burning coal. She slashed at the mist. Her claws connected with the vapor. There was a sound like water hitting hot oil. The mist recoiled, sizzling. "Get them back!" Leona shouted to Milton. Her voice was strained. Frost was creeping up her arms, turning the blue sleeves of her dress white. "I cannot hold it. It is eating the heat faster than I can make it." Milton reached the bench. He grabbed Tess under one arm and grabbed Lula's hand. He dragged them back toward the edge of the platform. "Garen, catch!" Milton yelled. He passed Tess down to the massive stonekin waiting below. Garen took the child as gently as if she were a pebble. Lula jumped into Mara's arms. "Go, get to the shop," Milton ordered. "Daddy!" Lula screamed, reaching back. "Leona is stuck!" Milton spun around. Leona was trapped. The null frost had encircled her. The gray mist had formed a ring, cutting her off from the edge. She was fighting, slashing at the tendrils of cold, but she was losing ground. Her movements were getting slower. The cold was getting into her joints. Milton froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew what he had to do. He knew the words. They were sitting on his tongue, heavy as lead bullets. The iron speech. But the memory hit him, the Ash Valley bunker. The way he had spoken to the stone hold, and the stone had held so hard, it had crushed everything around it. He remembered the sound of the enemy soldiers screaming as the building imploded. He remembered the feeling of being a god of destruction. "If I speak," Milton thought, panic seizing his throat, "I might break the dais. I might break the square. I might break her." He stood there paralyzed by his own power. Leona fell to one knee. The frost was at her throat. She looked up and saw him standing there frozen. She didn't look angry. She looked sad. "Milton," she gasped. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the unnatural silence of the frost he heard it. "Milton, if you keep holding everything tight, finally only you will be torn." She looked at his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You want to save the house," she whispered, her eyes closing as the cold took her. "But you are letting the fire go out." Something inside Milton snapped. Not a bone, a lock. It wasn't the lock on his power. It was the lock on his fear. He realized with a clarity that burned that his silence wasn't safety. His silence was just another form of the null frost. He was freezing himself to death to avoid burning anyone, but the result was the same. The people he loved were dying in the cold. "No," Milton said. He stepped forward. He walked right up to the wall of swirling gray mist. He raised his right hand. He didn't unclench his fist. He slammed it against the invisible barrier of the air. And he spoke. It wasn't English. It wasn't Falari. It was the language of the metal that binds the earth. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting. It was the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. "Sever!" The word didn't echo. It hit. A shockwave of pure force exploded from Milton's hand. It wasn't heat. It was kinetic authority. The wall of null frost didn't melt. It broke. The gray mist shattered like a glass window. The shards of frozen air flew outward, dissolving into harmless snow before they hit the ground. The impact cleared a circle 20 feet wide. Milton didn't stop. He stepped into the circle, reached down and grabbed Leona's arm. Her skin was ice cold. "Return," Milton commanded. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the heat in her blood, ordering it to flow again. Leona gasped, her eyes snapping open. She took a huge, shuddering breath. The color rushed back into her face so fast it looked painful. She looked at him. Milton was standing over her, his eyes glowing with a faint, terrifying silver light. His wrist was smoking, where the cuff of his shirt had burned away, revealing the Hearthwarden seal, a complex geometric scar that was pulsing with light. "You spoke," Leona whispered. "I spoke," Milton rasped. His throat felt raw, like he had swallowed gravel. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He pulled her up. She leaned against him, shivering but alive. The square was dead silent. The null frost had retreated, fleeing, back down the cracks in the stone, terrified of the authority that had just spoken. Rowan Pike crawled out from behind the podium. He looked at Milton. He looked at the smoking seal on Milton's wrist. His face went the color of old porridge. "A warden," Pike whispered. "You are a Hearthwarden. I thought the line ended." "The line ends when the fire goes out," Milton said. His voice was back to normal, but it held a new weight. He looked at the crowd. They weren't looking at him with suspicion anymore. They were looking at him with awe and fear. Milton hated the fear. He raised his hand, pointing at the shattered remains of the ash candles. "The trial is over," Milton declared. "The candles are dead. There is no judgment here today." He looked at Pike. "Leona stays with me. She stays under my roof, and she keeps her name because today her name was the only thing that stood between this city and the winter." Pike swallowed hard. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the angry Stonekin holding a child. He looked at the veteran with the silver eyes. "The court acknowledges the interruption," Pike stammered, trying to regain some shred of bureaucracy. "Due to technical failure of the adjudication apparatus, the defendant is released on recognizance." Pike gathered his robes and scrambled down from the dais, signaling his guards to retreat. He didn't run, but he walked very, very fast. The crowd parted for Milton and Leona as they walked down the steps. No one cheered. This hadn't been a victory. It had been a revelation. They walked to where Mara and Garen were waiting. Lula threw herself at Milton's legs, sobbing. Tess hugged Leona's tail, burying her face in the fur. "It is okay," Milton said, stroking Lula's hair. His hand was trembling uncontrollably, now that the adrenaline was fading. "We are going home." "Your shirt is ruined," Leona noted softly. She was looking at his wrist. "I have others," Milton said. They began the walk back to Chimney Row. The sun was trying to break through the clouds again. The air was warming up. But as they left the square, Leona stopped. Her ears swiveled back toward the dais. "Milton," she whispered. "Did you hear that?" Milton listened. He heard the murmur of the crowd. He heard the distant clang of a forge. "Hear what? Under the stone," Leona said, her eyes widening. "When you spoke, when you used the word," Milton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frost. "What did you hear, Leona?" "I heard a lock clicking open," she said. And then faintly from deep beneath the limestone pavement of the Merchant Square came a sound. Crack. It was the sound of something waking up, something that had been waiting for a warden's voice to give it permission to break free. Milton looked at Leona. The victory at the trial suddenly felt very small. "I think," Milton said grimly, "we just solved one problem and started a much bigger one." The walk back to Chimney Row felt longer than the march to the dais, though the distance had not changed. What had changed was the air. Before, it had been heavy with judgment. Now it was thin with reverence. Milton walked with his head up, but his eyes were fixed on the middle distance. He could feel the gazes of his neighbors latching onto him like burrs. Mrs. Gable, who usually shouted at him about his ivy crossing her fence, pulled her curtain shut as they passed. Mr. Henderson, the butcher, stopped, sweeping his stoop, and simply stared at Milton's exposed wrist, where the hearth-warden seal still glowed with a faint residual heat. They weren't looking at Milton the handyman anymore. They were looking at a weapon that had been left unlocked. "They are quiet," Leona noted, walking a half-step behind him. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders to hide the frostburns on her arms. "They are recalibrating," Milton said, his voice flat. "It is the same look a dog gives you when you take a stick away from it, only to reveal the stick was actually a loaded rifle." "I prefer the dog," Leona said. "At least the dog usually wags its tail after the shock wears off." They reached number 42. The house looked different. The red bricks seemed duller, the mortar gray and dry. The ivy that climbed the trellis was brown and brittle, crumbling at the touch of the wind. Milton unlocked the door. The key stuck. He had to jiggle it, forcing the tumblers to turn. When they stepped inside, the hallway was cold. Not cool cold. Home sweet icebox. Tess shivered, rubbing her arms. Milton went straight to the fireplace in the living room. The logs were their seasoned oak, but they were coated in a fine layer of gray dust. He struck a match. The flame flared, touched the wood, and then hissed out, as if the wood itself was wet. "The draw is dead," Milton said, standing up. "The chimney isn't breathing." Leona walked to the window. "It is not just the chimney, Milton. Look at the frame." Milton looked. The wood of the windowsill was soft pulpy. He pressed his thumb against it, and the wood gave way like wet cardboard. Underneath, where the grain should have been, was a network of gray veins. "Ash rot," Milton murmured. "The house is dying." "They say I did this," Leona said. She was looking out at the street where a small group of people had gathered, whispering and pointing at the house. "I can hear them. They say the Falari witch seduced the warden to break his vows, and now the city is paying the price." She turned to him, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "If seduction were that easy, Milton, I would have seduced the lock on my front door years ago." "They are scared," Milton said, brushing the ash from his hands. "Fear makes people stupid, and loud." "And dangerous," Leona added. "Milton, you exposed yourself. You used the iron speech. That sends a signal down the hearth line. Every instability in the crust is going to vibrate in sympathy." "I know," Milton said. He looked at Lula and Tess, who were huddled on the sofa under a blanket. Lula was reading a book to Tess, but her eyes kept darting to the cold fireplace. "I can't fix this from up here," Milton said. "The rot is coming from below. The null frost wasn't just weather. It was a symptom. The dais cracked because something underneath it is pushing up." "The undercourse," Leona said. It wasn't a question. "I have to go down," Milton said. "I have to find the breach in the hearthline and seal it, manually, before the rot eats the support beams and this whole neighborhood slides into the basement." "We are coming," Lula said. She hadn't looked up from her book, but her voice was steel. "No," Milton said immediately. "It is dangerous. There are gas pockets, old machinery, things that have been in the dark for 1,000 years." Lula closed the book. She stood up. She looked exactly like her mother had looked the day she told Milton she was joining the medical corps. "You are the hearth warden," Lula said. "But this is our house too. If the house dies, we have nowhere to go. And I am not letting my hero walk into the dark alone. Heroes who go alone usually don't come back for the sequel." Milton opened his mouth to argue, to give an order, but he looked at Tess. The little girl was putting on her boots. "I have my flashlight," Tess announced, holding up a toy that produced a beam of light, barely stronger than a candle. "And I have cookies, for emergencies." Milton looked at Leona. She shrugged her tail, swaying. "You cannot leave them here, Milton. If the mob gets brave, a wooden door won't stop them. They are safer in the dark with you than in the light without you." Milton sighed. He grabbed his heavy tool belt and cinched it around his waist. "Fine," he said. "But if I say run, you run. You don't ask why. You don't look back, you just run until your lungs burn. Understood?" "Understood," Lula said. "Understood," Tess cheered. The entrance to the undercourse was in the basement of the old guild hall, 3 blocks away. Milton picked the lock on the service grate, with practiced ease. The air that rushed up to meet them was stale, smelling of rust and ancient, dry heat. They descended the iron rungs of the ladder, dropping down into the darkness. Milton went first, then the girls, with Leona bringing up the rear, her eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The undercourse was a maze of brick tunnels built to channel the heat of the planet's core to the surface. Massive copper pipes ran along the ceiling, silent, now covered in verdigris. "It smells like old socks," Tess whispered, holding her nose. "It smells like history," Leona corrected gently. "Thousands of years of people working to keep the city warm." Milton swept his lantern beam across a wall covered in graffiti that dated back centuries. "It smells like history that someone forgot to clean up," he muttered. Lula giggled. Then Tess giggled. The sound bounced off the brick walls, bright and incongruous, in the oppressive dark. "See?" Leona said to Milton. "Fear shrinks when you laugh at it." They walked for an hour, following the main artery of the heat pipes. The deeper they went, the colder it got. Frost began to appear on the walls. Not normal frost, but the gray crystalline geometric patterns of the null frost. Milton stopped at a junction. He checked his compass. The needle was spinning wildly. "Magnetic interference," he said. "We are getting close to the breach." He sat down on a crate to check the map. Leona sat beside him, sharing a canteen of water. The girls were a few feet away, examining a pile of old gears. "Milton," Leona said softly, "I need to tell you something." "You don't have to explain the trial," Milton said, not looking up from the map. "You did what you had to do." "No," Leona said. She reached out her hand, hovering over his arm, but not touching it. "I need to tell you why I came to Chimney Row. Why was I at the hiring hall that day?" Milton looked at her. In the harsh light of the lantern, the angles of her face were sharp, predatory, yet her eyes were wide with vulnerability. "I didn't just wander into Glimmerholt," she confessed. "I was looking for you." Milton went still. "You knew who I was." "I knew the signature," Leona said. 10 years ago in the Ash Valley, when the bunker collapsed. I was half buried. I couldn't move. I heard a voice, a human voice speaking iron. It commanded the rock to hold. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor. She looked down at her hands. That voice saved me. It kept the mountain off my back. But then you disappeared. The warden vanished, and the cold started creeping back into the world. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I came to find the voice, Milton. I thought if I found the man who could command stone, maybe he could command the frost to stop. I wanted to use you." She flinched as she said it, waiting for his anger. Milton looked at her. He saw the guilt in her expression. He saw the fear that he would reject her. But he also felt a strange sense of relief. "You wanted a weapon," Milton said quietly. "Everyone wants a weapon, Leona. Pike wants one to keep order. The army wanted one to win the war." "I don't want a weapon anymore," Leona said fiercely. "I watched you with Tess. I watched you fix the kettle instead of buying a new one. I watched you sign a contract that burned your hand just to keep a stranger warm." She moved her hand, finally resting it on his arm. Her palm was warm. "I don't want the warden," she whispered. "I want the man who fixes things. I was afraid you would think I was just another person trying to extract something from you." "Are you?" Milton asked. "No," Leona said. "I am just someone who wants to be on your side of the wall when the world falls down." Milton looked at her hand on his arm. For 5 years he had touched people only to fix them or to move them out of danger. He had forgotten what it felt like to be touched, simply because someone wanted to bridge the gap. "I spent 5 years hiding," Milton said, his voice rough, "thinking that if I didn't use the power, I was safe. But look at us. My house is rotting. My daughter almost froze. The price of doing nothing is higher than the price of doing something wrong." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. "You didn't find a weapon, Leona. You found a mechanic who is very tired. But I think I am done hiding." Leona squeezed his hand. Her tail wrapped around his ankle, a silent, feline embrace. "Good," she said, "because I think we have company." Milton stood up instantly, pulling Leona up with him. He positioned himself in front of the girls. Down the tunnel, coming from the direction of the breach, a light appeared. It wasn't the erratic bobbing of a flashlight. It was the steady, cold glow of a chemical flare. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Rowan Pike. He looked terrible. His velvet coat was torn, his shoes were covered in muck, and his perfect hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. But he was holding something in his hands, a long spool of silver chain etched with microscopic runes. A null chain. "Mr. Vance." Pike wheezed. You are difficult to track. Pike, Milton said, his hand going to the heavy wrench on his belt. If you are here to serve another citation, I suggest you mail it. No citations, Pike said, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. Calculations. He held up the chain. The breach is ahead. I know what you intend to do, Vance. You intend to use the iron speech to seal it, to command the earth to close. It is the only way to stop the rot, Milton said. It is the only way to start the apocalypse, Pike countered. His voice wasn't arrogant anymore. It was desperate. Think, man, the hearthline isn't just a fire. It is a pressure system. The vows, the forced vows you hate so much, they act as control valves. They regulate the flow of energy. If you break the system with a brute force command, you don't just close the hole. You shatter the pipes. Pike took a step forward. I am not the villain here, Vance. I am the safety inspector. Yes, the system is cruel. Yes, it takes names and binds people. But it holds. It keeps the nullfrost out. If you go down there and start breaking chains, you will open the door to something that has been sleeping since the First Era. The system is rotting, Leona said, stepping forward. Look at the walls, Pike. The frost is already here. Your control valves are leaking. Because of instability, Pike shouted, losing his composure. Because of wild variables like you. No, Milton said. Because of entropy. You can't bind people forever, Pike. Eventually they break. And when they break, the house falls down. I cannot let you pass, Pike said. He stretched the silver chain across the tunnel. This is a kinetic barrier. It will stop a tank. Go back, Vance. Let the guild handle this. We will patch it. We will add more vows. We will stabilize it. With more slaves, Leona hissed. With necessary sacrifices, Pike shot back. Milton looked at the chain. He looked at Pike. He saw a man who was terrified clinging to his rulebook while the building burned around him. Lula, Milton said softly. Take Tess and Leona, stand back. Daddy, trust me. Milton walked toward the chain. Stop, Pike warned. It will fry your nervous system. Milton didn't stop. He walked right up to the silver barrier. He could feel the hum of it, a frequency designed to suppress will. He raised his right hand. The Hearthwarden seal flared, turning the dark tunnel white. You are right, Pike, Milton said. Brute force breaks the pipes, but I am not going to use force. I am going to use truth. He grabbed the chain. It hissed. Smoke rose from his palm. Milton didn't flinch. Unbind, Milton whispered. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a command of domination. It was a command of release. The runes on the silver chain glowed hot pink, then faded. The metal turned dull. The links dissolved into dust falling to the floor in a heap of gray powder. Pike stared at the pile of dust. He looked up at Milton, his mouth open. You didn't break it, Pike stammered. You untied it. I am a repairman, Milton said, stepping over the dust. I fix things. I don't just smash them. He walked past Pike, motioning for the others to follow. Coming, Pike, Milton asked over his shoulder. If you want to save your city, you might want to see what is actually under the floorboards. Pike hesitated. He looked back toward the safety of the surface. Then he looked at the darkness ahead. He adjusted his ruined coat, picked up his chemical light, and followed. For the record, Pike muttered, this is highly irregular. They reached the end of the undercourse 10 minutes later. They stepped out into a cavern that shouldn't have existed. It was a vast spherical hollow lined with obsidian. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone pedestal pulsing with a weak, erratic red light. This was the hollow hearth, the heart of Glimmerholt. But it wasn't empty. Above the pedestal, hovering in the air, was a mass of black, swirling energy. It looked like a knot, a chaotic, tangled mess of shadow and frost. And feeding into that knot were thousands of thin spectral threads. The vows, Leona whispered, horrified. Those are the vows. The threads stretched up through the roof of the cavern, leading to the houses above. But they weren't feeding the fire. They were choking it. The black knot was twisting them, pulling them tight, strangling the light. And under the knot on the pedestal was an inscription carved into the obsidian. Milton walked closer. The heat was intense here, but it was a sickly heat like a fever. He wiped the soot from the inscription. Here lies the first fire, fed by will, starved by force. To keep the gate, one must bind. To open the gate, one must choose. Milton read it twice. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It is a lid, Milton said. The whole system, the vows, the contracts, the repression of names isn't to fuel the fire. It is to keep the lid down. The lid on what? Pike asked, stepping up beside him. Milton pointed to the black knot. On that, Milton said. That isn't just instability. That is the accumulated weight of thousands of forced promises. It is resentment. It is the nullfrost. We have been feeding the monster to keep it asleep, but we have been feeding it the wrong thing. If we cut the vows, Pike whispered, the knot unravels. The lid blows off. And if we don't, Milton said, pointing to a large crack running down the side of the pedestal. The pressure builds until it explodes anyway. We are sitting on a bomb, Pike, and the timer is ticking. Leona stepped up to the other side of the pedestal. She looked at the black knot. So we have a choice, she said, her voice steady. We keep tightening the screws until they strip and we all die. Or we take the lid off and see if we can survive what comes out. Milton looked at Leona. He looked at his daughters standing at the entrance of the cavern, small figures against the vast dark. He looked at his hands, the hands that had fixed kettles and toasters, the hands that had held up a mountain. No, Milton said. There is a third option. He stepped up onto the pedestal. We don't destroy the lid, we replace it. He looked at Leona. Leona, I can't do this alone, I need a link. A new kind of vow. Not one written in ink and enforced by law. One spoken in iron and held by choice. What are you asking? Leona asked. I am asking you, Milton said, extending his hand toward the black, swirling chaos, to help me rewrite the foundation of this city. Right now, the cavern rumbled. The crack in the pedestal widened. A blast of cold air shot out, smelling of ancient winter. We are out of time, Milton yelled over the noise. Pike, record this. If we die, I want the next poor bastard to know what we tried. I am recording, Pike shouted, holding up a small crystal. Milton looked at Leona. Ready. Leona took a deep breath. She reached out and took his hand. Her claws dug into his skin, not to hurt but to hold on. Ready, she said. Milton closed his eyes. He reached deep into the well of his power, past the fear, past the trauma, past the mechanic who just wanted a quiet life. He found the warden, and he began to speak. The cavern of the hollow hearth was vibrating. It was not the mechanical hum of a well-oiled machine, nor the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping animal. It was the chaotic, dissonant shudder of something about to tear itself apart. Above the obsidian pedestal, the black knot of twisted energy writhed like a living storm. It was composed of thousands of spectral threads, the vows of Glimmerholt that had been pulled too tight, strangled by centuries of bureaucratic enforcement, until the light within them had turned into a suffocating cold gravity. Milton stood on the edge of the dais, the heat from the erratic red light of the pedestal washing over his face. He felt the immense weight of the moment. This was the engine of the city, and it was stalling. Rowan Pike scrambled up beside him, clutching his recording crystal with white-knuckled desperation. The hearthscribe looked at the swirling chaos, and then at Milton. You cannot simply rewrite a foundational law, Vance, Pike shouted over the roar of the energy. The hearth vow is a structural constant. It is the gravity that holds society together. If you remove the compulsion, you remove the guarantee of service, the economy will collapse, the safety protocols will fail. Milton turned to look at Pike. The red light cast deep shadows on the scribe's face, making him look less like a villain and more like a terrified man clinging to a rulebook on a sinking ship. "Rowan," Milton said, his voice cutting through the noise not by volume, but by the sheer weight of his conviction. "Look at it, really look at it," he pointed to the black knot. "That isn't gravity. That is a cage. You think you are preserving order, but you are just compressing resentment. You are storing it in the basement like gunpowder." "It is a necessary trade-off," Pike argued, though his voice wavered. "We trade absolute freedom for absolute stability. That is the compact of civilization." "Stability without heart is just a well-organized graveyard," Milton retorted, "and I am done being the caretaker of a cemetery." He turned his back on Pike and looked at Leona. She was standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the waves of cold radiating from the knot. Her eyes were fixed on him. In the hellish light of the dying hearth, she looked magnificent, not because she was unafraid, but because she was terrified and standing there anyway. Milton held out his hand. "Leona," he said, "I am going to try something. It has not been done since the First Era. I do not know if it will work. I do not know if the roof will hold." Leona stepped forward. She did not hesitate. She took his hand. Her palm was rough, calloused from work, and her claws were slightly extended, pricking his skin. It was a grounding sensation, real pain, real warmth. "I trust the roof," Leona said, her voice steady. "But mostly, I trust the mechanic." "This isn't a repair job," Milton admitted softly. "This is a renovation. I have to tear it down to the studs." He looked at the black knot, then back to her. "To open the gate, one must choose," Milton quoted the inscription. "I am going to strip the compulsion from the vow. I am going to make it powerless unless it is fed by free will. But to anchor it, to keep the hearth line from dissipating into the ether, I need a partner. I need someone to stand on the other side of the fire and say yes when they could say no." Leona squeezed his hand. "You are asking for a vow of choice." "I am asking if you want to stay," Milton said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "Not because the paper says so. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because you owe me for the trial. But because you want to be there." Leona looked at him. The chaos of the cavern seemed to fade into the background. "Milton," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I spent 5 years walking across a continent to find a voice I heard in the dark. I didn't come for a job. I didn't come for safety. I came for you." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, her tail curling around his leg. "I don't need you to save me, Milton. I am not a damsel, and I am certainly not a pet. I need you to choose me. Just me. With the claws and the history and the bad soup." Milton felt something in his chest unlock a final rusty tumbler, clicking into place. It was the realization that for 10 years he had been defining himself by what he had lost, never by what he could still find. "The soup wasn't that bad," Milton lied. "It was terrible," Leona whispered. "But we can work on the recipe." "Hey!" The shout came from the tunnel entrance. It was small, indignant, and echoed surprisingly well in the vast chamber. Tess was standing there, hands on her hips, her flashlight beam wobbling as she stomped her foot. Lula was right behind her, looking mortified but protective. "I am officially freezing," Tess announced. "If you two are going to do the kissing stuff, can you do it fast? My toes are turning into ice cubes." "Tess!" Lula hissed, trying to pull her sister back. "Impolite. This is a dramatic moment." "I don't care about drama," Tess grumbled, letting out a massive yawn. "I care about hypothermia." Milton threw his head back and laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, but it broke the heavy atmosphere of doom completely. Leona chuckled, that deep, vibrating purr in her chest. "The criticism is noted," Milton called out to his daughters. "We are proceeding to the finale now." He turned back to the pedestal. The laughter died, replaced by a focused, diamond-hard intensity. He squeezed Leona's hand one last time, then placed his other hand directly onto the obsidian surface of the altar. He didn't scream. He didn't brace himself. He simply exhaled. He reached for the iron speech, but he didn't grab it like a hammer. He picked it up like a needle. "Unweave," Milton whispered. The word slid into the air like mercury. It didn't strike the black knot. It infiltrated it. The command wasn't to break. It was to loosen. Above them, the thousands of spectral threads began to vibrate. The black sludge of resentment, the accumulated weight of centuries of "I have to," began to flake away like dried mud. "Open," Milton commanded, his voice rising slightly. "Yield to the will." The knot spasmed. The black color began to bleed out, replaced by a dull, pulsing gray. The threads were untying, but they were also fading. The connection was dissolving. Without the binding force of the law, the hearthline was losing its cohesion. The fire in the pedestal began to dim. "It is fading," Pike screamed, checking his instruments. "The pressure is dropping to zero. The fire is going out. You are killing the city." "Leona," Milton said, sweat beading on his forehead. "Now," Leona stepped up to the pedestal. She placed her free hand on the stone mirroring Milton. "What do I say?" she asked. "Your name," Milton said, his eyes glowing with the silver light of the warden. "The real one. The one the contract forbade you to speak. Claim your place. Tell the fire who lives here." Leona closed her eyes. She took a breath that seemed to draw in all the remaining warmth of the cavern. She didn't whisper. She spoke with the resonance of the Falari, a voice that carried the harmonics of the wild places. "I am Leona of the High Ridge," she said. "I am the walker in the snow. I am the keeper of the memory." The pedestal shuddered. The gray threads stopped fading. They began to glow. "And I choose this hearth," Leona continued, her voice growing stronger, vibrating against the stone walls. "I choose this roof. I choose this man." She opened her eyes. They were burning gold. "My vow is my own, and I give it freely." Boom. The sound was not an explosion. It was an implosion of light. The black knot above them disintegrated completely. In its place, the spectral threads didn't vanish. They ignited. They turned a brilliant, blinding white gold. They snapped straight taut, not with tension, but with strength. The fire in the pedestal roared back to life. It wasn't the angry red of before. It was a clean, pure violet white, the color of absolute combustion, the color of a star. A wave of warmth exploded outward. It washed over Milton and Leona, blowing their hair back. It rushed past Pike, knocking him to his knees. It swept over Lula and Tess, who squealed as the sudden heat tickled their noses. It rushed up the tunnel, up the undercourse, racing through the copper pipes, into the basements, up the chimneys, and into every living room in Glimmerholt. "The readings," Pike gasped, staring at his crystal. The device was glowing so brightly it illuminated his face. "Efficiency 100%, 110. The resistance is gone. The friction is gone." He looked up at Milton, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It works. The flow is stable, more stable than it has been in 300 years. Milton took his hand off the pedestal. He staggered, drained. Leona caught him. "You did it," she whispered into his ear. "We did it," Milton corrected, leaning his weight against her. He looked at the new fire. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was free. Lula and Tess ran forward, ignoring the heat, and slammed into Milton's legs. He dropped to his knees, embracing them, pulling Leona down into the huddle until they were just a tangled pile of family on the floor of the Earth's engine room. "Is it over?" Tess asked, patting Milton's face. "Is the monster gone?" "The monster is gone," Milton promised. "And the house is warm." Lula looked at Leona. The 7-year-old's face was solemn, her dark eyes reflecting the violet fire. "I knew you would fix it," Lula said. "You had a lot of faith in a maid you just met," Leona teased gently, brushing soot from Lula's cheek. Lula shook her head. "Not just met. Daddy told us." Milton froze. He looked at Lula. "Lula, we talked about this. I told you stories. I didn't know—" "You knew," Lula insisted. "In the stories you said the Catwoman had eyes like gold coins and a scar on her ear like a little notch." Lula reached out and touched the tip of Leona's left ear, where a tiny white notch of scar tissue broke the fur. "And you said she smelled like snow and gunpowder," Lula continued. "When Leona walked into the hall that first day, she smelled like snow, even though she was inside." Milton looked at Leona. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You remembered the scar?" she asked softly. "I remembered a lot of things," Milton stammered, "but I was delirious. I had a concussion. I thought I hallucinated half of it. I thought the Falari who carried me was a dream." "You were heavy for a dream," Leona said dryly. "Wait," Milton said, his mind racing. "The story I told them that the Falari made me promise something before I passed out." "You promised to build a house," Leona supplied. "You were raving. You kept saying, if I get out of here, I am going to build a house where the walls don't shake. And I am going to make soup that actually tastes like food." She laughed, a watery sound. "I tracked you down, Milton. Not just because of the voice, but because you owed me a bowl of soup. And a roof." "I thought I owed you a life," Milton said. "That too," Leona shrugged. "But the roof seemed more immediate." Milton looked at his daughters. They had known. In the way children know things that adults are too complicated to see. They had seen the connection before he had even signed the paper. "So," Tess said, breaking the moment again, "since we fixed the world, can we go eat? I have cookies in my pocket, but they are all melty now." Milton groaned as he stood up, his joints popping. He offered a hand to Leona, then to Pike, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the fire. "Come on, Pike," Milton said. "Up you get." Rowan Pike stood up slowly. He brushed the dust from his ruined velvet coat. He looked at the inscription on the pedestal, now glowing with the new violet light. "To open the gate, one must choose," Pike read aloud. He looked at Milton. "I will have to rewrite the entire civil code. The paperwork will be astronomical." "Better start now," Milton said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But first we walk out of here." "Vance," Pike said, stopping him. "You realize what you are. You aren't just a veteran. You are the last one. The last Hearthwarden. No one else could have done this. If you hadn't, if you had stayed hidden." "If I had stayed hidden," Milton finished, "the Null Frost would have used those forced vows as a highway to freeze every heart in Glimmerholt." Pike nodded slowly. It wasn't a nod of submission. It was a nod of data acceptance. The evidence was irrefutable. "I will omit the breaking and entering charges from my report," Pike said stiffly. "And I might emphasize the success of the new volunteer protocol." "You do that, Rowan," Leona said. "Call it what you want. Just don't call it mandatory." 3 months later, the sign above the shop door was fresh, painted in bright, cheerful letters that smelled of linseed oil. "Vance, Leona Hearth repairs consultations. Heating systems, toasters, and vow reform." Milton stood on the ladder, adjusting the hook for the sign. The morning sun of Glimmerholt was shining, and for the first time in years the light didn't look filtered or hazy. It was crisp. "A little to the left," Leona called out from the sidewalk. She was wearing overalls, denim ones, with a hole cut for her tail. She held a clipboard, looking every inch the foreman she had become. My left or your left? Milton asked. The house's left, Leona said. It wants to be symmetrical. Milton shifted the sign. Better. Perfect. He climbed down. The street was busy. People were walking by and they didn't cross to the other side anymore. Mr. Henderson waved from the butcher shop. Mrs. Gable actually smiled, though she still watched her Ivy suspiciously. The mood in Glimmerholt had changed. It hadn't happened overnight. The volunteer protocol was messy. People were confused. Some vows broke. Some marriages ended. But many more were rewritten stronger this time because the ink wasn't mixed with fear. The Nullfrost had retreated to the poles, unable to find purchase in a city where the heat was generated by choice. The shop door opened with a jingle of bells. A young couple walked out looking relieved. They held a new contract in their hands, a vow of partnership drafted by Leona and sealed by Milton, not with blood or ash, but with simple, clear intent. Thank you, Warden, the young man said, shaking Milton's hand. Just Milton, Milton corrected. I only ward the toaster ovens these days. The couple left, looking happy. We have 3 more appointments this afternoon, Leona said, checking the list. And Mrs. Brindle wants you to look at her boiler. She says she is singing opera. I will take a look, Milton said. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the house number 42. The bricks were red and healthy. The ivy was green. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, white and clean. The front door banged open. Lula and Tess ran out, backpacks on. School time, Tess yelled. Bye, Daddy, bye, Leona. Lunch is in the bag, Leona shouted after them. Do not trade the apples for candy. We promise, Lula called back. A real promise, Leona asked. A choice promise, Lula shouted, disappearing around the corner. Leona smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners, where the gold met the skin. They are learning, she said. They have good teachers, Milton replied. He looked at her. Really looked at her. 3 months ago, she had been a stranger in a hiring line, wearing a mourning band and a mask of silence. Now she was the anchor of his life. He reached out and took her hand. He didn't cover his wrist anymore. The scar of the Hearthwarden seal was still there, but it was quiet now, a dormant volcano that only rumbled when he asked it to. You know, Milton said. I never did pay you that signing bonus. 15 silver pieces. Leona squeezed his hand, her claws, gently pricking his palm. Keep the silver, Milton, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. I think I got the better end of the deal. She looked up at the sign, then at the open door of the shop where the warmth of the hearth spilled out onto the street. Ready to open for business? She asked. Milton looked at the street. He looked at the city that was slowly, painfully, but surely learning how to breathe without a corset. Yeah, Milton said. He put his arm around her waist. Let's go home. They walked inside. The door closed with a solid, confident click. In the living room in the heart of the house, the fire in the grate crackled. It didn't burn orange and it didn't burn red. It burned with a deep, steady violet core tipped with gold, a fire that consumed nothing but warmed everything. And for the first time in 10 years, the shadows in the corner of the room didn't look like ghosts. They just looked like places where the light hadn't reached yet.